Okay, what I want to do is run through some slides. What I like to start off with is a couple vignettes on video clip that I like to give because they kind of define what we're talking about. Because CVE is something I think is very pernicious. It's called combating violent extremism or countering violent extremism, and it's cast as how we go after Al-Qaeda over there. I believe that the CVE is about going after American citizens here. And I think there's an awful lot more there than sounds when you just say something. Back about 2006, 2007, Fox News had something called the Fox News Half-Hour News Program. It was a comedy and a spoof. And they put this spoof together because everybody knew what they were talking about and everybody thought it was funny and it was a joke. And what I want to do is show this right now. Let me just say, when I go to some slides, what I want to say is these are ones I rapidly pulled together a week ago to brief on Capitol Hill, and it's not done yet. So after we do this, and we only have an hour, we'll just take the slides far enough in to where it's over with, because what I want to do is get you to understand that there is something called the CVE. If it passes, it puts our entire counterterrorism effort in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood domestically and OIC member states, by which I mean Islamic countries abroad. It's already de facto that way. This would have the effect of making it de jure. And what I want to point out for people, because I ask you to be skeptical, okay? Because this brief is not going to go wrong. There's no looking at things through a prism and dividing the light spectrum so you can see it a certain way. This is coming straight at us, and it's a part of a two-pronged strategy, both of which are supposed to hit this year. So what I'll do is I'll start with this little video clip.
6 men have just been charged with conspiracy to murder in connection with a plot to blow up buses and subway cars in London during the summer of 2005.
The 6 would-be suicide bombers charged are Mukhtar Saeed Abraham, Ramzi Mohammed, Yassin Omar, Manfu Asaidu, Adel Yahya, and Hussein Osman.
Since their capture, the big question for Scotland Yard has been, what exactly is it that links these 6 individuals? What common denominator motivated this seemingly random group of young men?
It is puzzling, isn't it? You know, but here to help us untangle this mystery, please welcome international terrorism expert Dr. Franklin Robertson. Welcome, Doctor.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here. I got to tell you, you know what this case reminds me of, Doc? A more successful bombing attack in London during July of 2005.
You mean the suicide bombings carried out by Mohammed Sadiq Khan, Shazir Tanwir, Abdullah Shazid Jamal, and Hasbib Hussein, Kurt?
I believe that was them, yes. Now, weren't the 2 cases kind of similar?
Similar. In what way?
I don't know. Maybe both involved buses, subways, suicide bombers?
You know, Kurt, it's tempting to try to concoct these conspiracy theories to explain these incidents, but most of those just don't hold water.
But, I mean, it could be a conspiracy, couldn't it? I mean, like last August when 10 people were arrested in London for trying to blow up those U.S.-bound airplanes.
Yes. You mean Ahmad, Abdullah Ali, Tanvir Hussein, Umar Islam, Arafat Wahid Khan, Assad Ali Sawar, Adam Khatib, Ibrahim Savan, Wahid Zaman, Qasar Ali, and Moran Hussein?
It does sound like that, yeah. But, Doctor, you can't tell me those guys didn't have anything in common, I mean, besides a desire to blow things up?
Well, if you say so, Kurt, and what might that be?
Okay, well, let's see. Were they all young males?
No, one was a woman.
All right, that's a dead end. Okay, well, how about this? Were they all from the same hometown?
No, they were all from different London suburbs. Not so easy, is it, Kurt?
No.
Did any of them have eating disorders? Those can make you crazy.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. Now, funny you should ask that because we just learned that none of them would eat pork. Still don't know what that means yet, but...
Okay. Well, how about this? Were they all going by their original names?
No. Kurt, Umar Islam was born Brian Young, but he changed his name after he converted.
Converted? To what?
Islam.
Oh, geez, another dead end.
Everybody knows Islam is a religion of peace. Yeah. So that doesn't work.
Oh, look, we've spent thousands of hours studying this, and frankly, we're stumped.
Well, Doc, you know, you're the expert, and I guess if there were something that linked Mukhtar Saeed Abraham, Ramzi Mohammed, Yassin Omar, Manfu Asaidu, Adel Yahya, and Hussein Osman...
Or for that matter, Mohammed Sadiq Khan, Shazid Tanwir, Abdullah Shazid Jamal, and Hasbib Hussein.
Yeah, if they had anything linking them, you would have discovered it by now.
That's right.
Right.
No, we would have. So in the meantime, why don't you just let the detective work be done by the detectives?
You got it. Thanks for joining us
Thank
today,
you.
Dr. Robertson.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There's the stuff.
So what we were watching right there was a comedy spoof, and it was intended to be a comedy spoof, and everybody knew what was going on here. Here you have the expert who's got a political science or a sociological degree or an anthropological degree, and he's basically analyzing terrorism, and the very discussion of the topic defines who the players are. Would you say that's fair? And what's funny, the reason everybody laughs is this is what they're hearing. Well, what I would like to point out, that when this was made, it was still a joke. But now I'm going to show you something. This is a couple years ago. This is a joint House-Senate Homeland Security hearing, and you're going to see Congressman Lundgren, who at the time was a ranking Republican, ask the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Affairs some questions. And I want you to understand, if this is what the Assistant Secretary of Defense would say to a congressman in an Article I oversight hearing, where Congress is exercising its authority under the Constitution to conduct oversight, what do you think he's doing to the troops under it? Because maybe this is not so funny. Oh, let me say this as well. This is Congressman Lundgren. About 10 days earlier, me and somebody else, Pat Poole, were locked into the House Judiciary Library, and a certain congressman whose name will not be revealed locked us there, and he would bring people off the floor to give him some briefings, and one of them was Lundgren. And the discussion was really testy, because he would push back and we would push, and finally, I know that when he started asking these questions 10 days later, he was trying to prove that we were wrong. And he's got a couple expressions there, and I know what he's thinking. I'm joking when I say this. Those blank, 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 they were right. So let's take a look.
Back, and I recognize the former Attorney General of the State of California and the Chairman of our Cybersecurity Subcommittee, Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say unequivocally my great support for those who are serving in the military today, and for those of you who are appearing on this panel. Secretary Stockton, are we at war with violent Islamist extremism?
No, sir. We are at war with Al-Qaeda, its
Okay, I
affiliates and
understand that.
adherents.
My question is violent Islamist extremism at war with us?
No, sir. We are being attacked by Al-Qaeda and its allies.
Is Al-Qaeda, can it be described as being an exponent of violent Islamist extremism?
The Al-Qaeda are murderers with
No,
an ideological
that's not my question.
agenda.
That wasn't my question. My question was, is Al-Qaeda acting out violent Islamist extremism?
Al-Qaeda is a violent organization dedicated to overthrowing the values that we intend to
Is it
advance.
yes or no?
Can I hear the question again? I'll make it as clear as I can. We are not at war with Islam.
I didn't ask
And
that.
it is
I
not,
did not ask that, sir. I asked whether we're at war with violent Islamist extremism. That's my question.
No, we're at war with Al-Qaeda and its affiliates.
Al-Qaeda, how does Al-Qaeda define itself? Are they dedicated to violent Islamist extremism?
Al-Qaeda would love to convince Muslims around the world that the United States is at war with Islam.
I didn't
That's
say
a prime
that.
propaganda
Sir,
tool, and I'm not going to aid and abet that
No,
effort
my
to
question is,
advance their propaganda
is there
goals.
a difference between Islam and violent Islamist extremism?
Sir, with great respect, I don't believe it's helpful to frame our adversary as Islamic with any set of qualifiers that we might add, because we are not at war with Islam.
I understand that. I never said we were at war with Islam. One of the questions we're trying to deal with is the radicalization of Islam, is the radicalization of Islamic youth. And if we can't distinguish between violent Islamist extremism and Islam, then all this stuff about behavioral indicators doesn't mean anything. Well, let me ask you this question. Is it a behavioral indicator to put on your card that you're a soldier of Allah?
A behavioral indicator that you have a copy of Inspire magazine on your desk?
That's not my question. My question is it a behavioral indicator to put on your card that you are a soldier of Allah, as Major Hassan did?
We have behavioral indicators now that enable our personnel, our supervisors, to focus on detecting indicators of violent extremism that reflect the lessons learned from Fort Hood.
Okay, is that a lesson learned? That if you put soldier of Allah on your card, that you ought to follow up and investigate that?
We're training our supervisors to follow up on appropriate indicators and exercise the leadership they need in order to provide for effective reporting and intervention.
You agree with the statement of someone representing the Department of Defense on the weekend after the shooting that it would be a greater tragedy to lose our program of diversity than what had occurred?
Well, let me go back to something Chairman King said. I was trained up by Senator Moynihan. There was nobody less politically correct than Senator Moynihan. I follow the truth wherever it takes me, and I strongly support the programs of the Department of Defense that focus on al-Qaeda and behavioral indicators.
I appreciate
this is not about political correctness. This is about defeating our adversary.
Sir, I would disagree with you that it may not be about political correctness. We are here talking about the fact that we now have to have behavioral indicators. I agree with that. But my question is, if someone gives inflammatory remarks, as did Major Hassan, in an open setting, if he has on his card that he was a soldier of Allah, it seems to me to be beyond common sense to think those are not behavioral indicators. So my question is, if I'm a member of the military today and I see those two events or those two circumstances, would it be appropriate for me to report those as behavioral indicators? Now, that's not a question of whether or not you're being politically correct, sir. I'm asking to answer that specific question. If I'm a soldier and ask you that question, what do you tell me?
Inflammatory rhetoric of the sort associated with Major Hassan that needs to be reported, and our officers are trained up now to report on that behavior.
I thank you, and I appreciate that. Mr. Stuvall.
The gentleman's time has expired. If he...
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so what was this about? What this is about is the fact that the policy is to analyze the war on terror without reference to the enemy's stated threat doctrine. Now, what do I mean by that? The enemy in the war on terror unconditionally states that he fights jihad according to Islamic law to implement Islamic law. Who disagrees with that? I mean, we could just fill up from 1 year hundreds of pages of claims like that. Now let me follow up. It doesn't matter whether their understanding of Islam is correct or not. What matters is it's the basis of their threat doctrine, which means that we cannot get to a strategic response to Al-Qaeda or ISIS if we will not get into the language they use to define themselves and their strategies, even if they're wrong. But even if they're wrong, that's an issue of fact that has to be determined by direct investigation. Anybody disagree with that? So here's the bottom line. The enemy in the war on terror planned from the beginning to win the war by removing the language that defines them from your ability to use when you do threat analysis. So when you're saying violent extremism, you're not talking about terrorism. And when you talk about violent extremists, you're not talking about ISIS or Al-Qaeda or the Muslim Brotherhood. And there it is. You cannot have a strategy to defeat an enemy you will not define. You can have every tactical success on the battlefield. If you have enough forces over there, that tactical success can generate to temporary operational success while you maintain the force. But once you leave, the operational success will collapse. There can be no strategy, because for there to be a strategy, you have to define the enemy to defeat it. This is as old as Sun Tzu's know the enemy, know yourself, and you will win every war. The enemy knows. We're afraid to define him. We don't really define ourselves accurately, so we know that what our critical weaknesses are. And we make it a crime for anybody to talk about it. So this is a CVE draft I put together because things are in motion right now. And I just want to talk about it. So I argue that the removal of language was in full force, not starting with Obama, but under the Bush administration. And I was living it. I was an intelligence officer on the Joint Staff in the Targeting Division. I was a member of Central Command. I worked on some special operations programs. I've been along for a long time. Here is a document that came out in January 2008 called Terminology to Define the Terrorism Recommendations from American Muslims. Well, when somebody asked Chertoff to define who those moderate Muslims were, they refused. It turned out, of course, who do you think they were? Brotherhood. ISNA, CARE, MPAC, Brotherhood. So it was their language to do this. So, but if we're not allowed to use their language, like I'm saying, how do we define them? So, what did they say? We should not use the language of Islam. We shouldn't talk about jihad. We shouldn't talk about caliphate, because it validates them and it recognizes them. Have you heard that before? We can't use that language. Well, you know what? If you call the Germans in World War II, you are recognizing them.
Yeah.
Are they not there if you don't call them that?
Yeah.
I mean, I want you to think about this. Isn't this the equivalent of a 3-year-old hiding behind the curtains, and because he can't see you, you can't see him? I want you to not only understand that this is ridiculous, it is also infantile.
Yeah.
Okay? It's extremely infantile. So, what we have here, is proceed carefully before using Arabic and religious terminology. American officials should be very careful not to mispronounce it. This is out of great care for us. So if we mispronounce the word jihad, something's wrong. But remember, this came out of DHS, and DHS manages the domestic counter-terror. Do not give the terrorists legitimacy they seek. Therefore, experts counsel caution in using such words as jihadists, Islamic terrorists, Islamist, holy warriors, because it's grandiose. Have the Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Division at DHS take a look at this. They also told us not to use the word Islamist unless we knew what we were saying. Now, I've been one of those people who said the word Islamist is a created word that means nothing. And they got us to use that instead of using Islam. Why? Because they pushed us off this, they gave us this word, and this is going to be Wile E. Coyote stepping over the cliff and looking down and going down over and over and over again. So, talk about the terrorists as if they're a death-like cult. Call them cultists. Call them dead-enders. Call them violent extremists. But don't call them Al-Qaeda. I was just in Vienna in May at a diplomatic forum called the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And at the OSCE, which is a formal diplomatic function the U.S. is a party to, there was an actual forum where it was argued, and favorably argued, that calling the Islamic State, should constitute hate speech. Someone said, but the Islamic State calls themselves the Islamic State. And the answer was, well, that may be, but if you call them the Islamic State, you're validating a stereotype that some Muslims want to kill other Muslims, and therefore it should be hate speech. And then someone later asked the question, are you saying that saying something known to be true can constitute hate speech? Known to be true, where everybody in the discussion acknowledges the truth. And the answer was yes. Now, I understand you're laughing, but the CVE is about implementing that. So, who was the author? Sharif Zafar. How do we know? Because it's in the notes section of the document. And who is he? He's a special representative to Muslim communities. He was the person who wrote this document. It turns out he also drifted over to the NCTC, where 3 months later, this document came out in March 2008 called Words That Work and Words That Don't, a Guide for Counterterrorism Communications. And it was adopted. In fact, they say right here, they got it from the Homeland Security Terminology Defined. So here we have the same person doing one is doing the other. And what do we have? Try to limit the number of non-English terms you use if you are speaking English. I mean, this is not junior high. These are professionals. What do you call the Soviet Union, if not the Soviet Union? What do you call Nazis, if not Nazis? You see what I'm saying? This is about the pushing off and creating these academic models that make this sound reasonable. So I don't want to go into the details of these slides because this is stuff I was going into the details of on Capitol Hill, but basically we can't use their language. And of course, here we have the Society of Professional Journalists, which is a very left-wing organization that was involved in this, the SPLC, excuse me, Southern, no, it's the SPJ, Southern Society of Professional Journalists. So all I'm showing you here is the language they're saying should be banned is something MPAC was already saying should be banned. So it's like, well, that's interesting. A Brotherhood-related organization is talking about the language we shouldn't use. And here's DHS and the NCTC. Who here doesn't know what the NCTC is? The NCTC is the National Counter-terrorism Center. This is where all the agencies that do counter-terror come together. Now, what is the NCTC looking at when they're doing counter-terror against an ISIS strike in America, Al-Qaeda strike in America, or Brotherhood subversion efforts here, if they're not looking using this language? Does the Muslim Brotherhood say, we are here to engage in subversion by violent extremist actions because we're violent extremists? They don't. So how does the NCT define jihad? The global totalitarian state. Doesn't that sound perfectly sedate? And then what happens? They bring in books about what? Stalin, Hitler. Okay? And all of a sudden, everybody's writing their position papers and their master's papers at the intelligence colleges talking about what Hitler did. And then there'll be a paragraph at the beginning saying it's just like this. And then at the end, they'll say it's just like that. And see, now we've just discussed the Third Reich, the Soviet Union, the Comintern, and now we're experts on what we would call ISIS, if we're allowed to call it ISIS, but we'll call it the global totalitarian state. So the record here that we have of all this language coming from the Brotherhood is really easy to lock in. And if we get books written by Muslims for Muslims on the topic, it turns out, like for example, this book, The Hidayah, that it defines harb as enemy, it defines jihad as war. This book on Islamic law of warfare calls harb the war. Harbi is the enemy person, and jihad is just war or holy war. So when we buy books on jihad that's sold in the Muslim market, that's exactly what they define it as. Okay, there's no ambiguity here. So I just want to show you all the different examples I could bring together. Here is at the time a man named Akram. He was at the time the head of the Muslim Brotherhood. An interview said, do you consider Osama bin Laden a terrorist or an Islamic mujahid, meaning a holy warrior, a jihadi? And he said, most certainly he's a jihadi. But I thought the Muslim Brotherhood said they disowned Al-Qaeda. So what I'd like to point out is our foreign policy, our policy on counterterrorism has been reduced to total incoherence. You go over and see what's going on in Iraq and Syria. When I was on the Hill back in 2010, I put together a briefing, and we may have a couple slides that hit this evening. I started briefing Watch Out. It looks like we've changed sides in the war on terror. And we're going to see the entire Middle East come down, and I clicked off every country and exactly the order they were to go down. And I said it's going to be cast as a democratic action. It's going to be a Muslim Brotherhood action from the very beginning. 4 months later, the Arab Spring starts. And I had a white arrow. That was when it got to Syria. I said, this is when everything's going to break down, and we may look at total World War III. And in fact, that's exactly where we're at right now. It's burning over. So all I like to say is Homeland Security, the NCTC, and here's the FBI's counter-terror lexicon, and all of them purge their language. Purge their language of anything having to do with Islam at all. Now, the reason this is important is the enemy we fight in the war on terror exclusively defines what they do based on Islam, even if they're wrong. And so here what I have here, I briefed this to the BAU, Behavioral Analysis Unit, that the definition that the FBI uses for violent extremism is so incoherent. At the end it says, an analytical judgment that an individual is a violent extremist or radical is not predication for any investigated action or technique. So what is the FBI doing? They're telling you that their lexicon requires you to use the word violent extremist, but at the very end of the very definition they say, but if you use these criteria, it cannot be the predicate for investigation. The FBI only does initial investigations as predicate for a real investigation. So if you actually follow this, you can't make an investigation out of it. So that came out in 2008, Bush administration. Briefed it at the BAU. I have a whole series of slides on this from the brief that was given at the time. So one of the things I like to point out is, with violent extremism, CVE, countering violent extremism, is you use the language to talk about going after, of course, like I'm saying, Al-Qaeda or ISIS. But if you take a look, get a stack of Time magazine articles, or just do a search on any number of, do CVE for articles and go, and no matter how much it starts, the article starts with bin Laden and something, or something going on in Syria, it always ends with somebody talking about the Constitution here. And in fact, DHS came out with something, remember? Right-wing extremism, current economic and political climate, refueling resurgent radicalization. So what is DHS talking about? Violent extremism and talking about right-wing extremists. Who are right-wing extremists? That would be just about anybody in this room. Okay? Make sense? So then we have, and that came out right at the start of the Obama administration. Then we had challenges from the sidelines, understanding America's violent far right. And where did this come from? It was released, it was published at West Point. And you go into the document, and the document says, there are three major ideological movements within the American violent far right. A racist white supremacy movement, an anti-federalist movement, and a fundamentalist movement. So if you are a Federalist movement, you are in the same category as a white racist, and of course, throw in fundamentalists. You see what's happening there? This is West Point. These are the people training our future officers. And it tells you, the anti-federalist movement, they also espouse strong convictions regarding the federal government, believing it to be corrupt and tyrannical, with a natural tendency to intrude on individuals' civil and constitutional rights. Finally, they support civil activism, individual freedoms, and self-government. This is who are being defined as right-wing extremists and the violent extremism. So one of the things is, and I'm not going to go through all these slides. I just wanted to run through the Capitol Hill slide I gave so you understand. They're understanding that this is going on. Does anybody want to continue with this part?
Yeah.
I actually did this once at Atlanta, and it was just a secondary thing to a main point. And they stopped the brief and brought in state legislatures. They were so angry. While liberal worldviews are future or progressive-oriented, conservative perspectives are more past-oriented, and in general are interested in preserving the status quo. The far right represents a more extreme version of conservatism. One of the codes you have to crack is all conservatism is extremism in this paradigm. And its political vision is usually justified by the aspiration to restore or preserve values and practices that are part of an idealized historical heritage of the nation or ethnic community. Okay, this is about the idea that you want to save the Constitution, and by an ethnic community, by white people. Okay? In many cases, these past-oriented perspectives help to formulate a nostalgic and romantic ideological aura, which makes these groups attractive for many who aspire to restore to the halcyon days. So do you see what this language is basically setting up? So you create a narrative to say these people are extremists, and then all of a sudden you want to say, well, I don't want to be called them, so I'll start coming to meetings like this. Does anybody understand that's the intent? So, on the conceptual level, there are irreconcilable tensions between core nationalist elements, internal homogenization and nativism of the far-right groups on the one hand, and liberal democratic value system on the other. So, of course, what I like to show when I did this was I showed that far-right was used 182 times, anti-federalist 18 times, fundamentalist 18 times, with regard to Christians 4 times, the Christian Identity Movement, which is a right-wing racist group. But that's not made clear in this. I mean, if you understand what I'm saying. White supremacists, and then the sovereign citizen movement. The Southern Poverty Law Center is mentioned 26 times. Why? Because this document that came out of West Point really had its basis in the Southern Poverty Law Center. Who here has not heard of the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center? Everybody heard of it? Aware of it? Okay, this is the level of penetration. So, of course, there's a whole briefing on that breaks it down too. So here we're back to the Sharif Zafar, the person who wrote that one article for DHS and seemed to be present at NCTC when that got written. And here he is at that same meeting in Vienna where they said, calling his Islamic State, the Islamic State constitutes hate crime. What does he say? At the same conference where it was favorably argued that calling the Islamic State should constitute hate speech, where it's also argued that stating something known to be true can likewise constitute hate speech, he said, now this is hard, talking about the CVE, countering violent extremism. Now this is hard. This is not hard science or math. You know, 1 + 1 = 2. This is not hard science. This is social science. So when you're dealing in the realm of social science, you'll never, ever be able to predict with a level of accuracy what causes one person to become a terrorist and what causes one person not to do so. So you can take a best guess. And by the way, this framework that I'm putting out now applies not only to groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but also applies to far-right and far-left group terrorists too. So what he's basically saying here, how many people have heard the thing from the 1984? Get that person, say 1 + 1 = 3. Okay? He's telling you that what they're doing is 1 + 1 = 3. It's not science. And you see, I'm a lawyer, I have a law, I'm not practicing law anymore, but I'm still a member of the bar. And intelligence analysis, counter-terrorism analysis should be based on facts, not on political theories, not on social science theories. And you see, what he's basically acknowledging is the whole CVE is based on academic models. What's the first thing you do with an academic model? You push it up. So here we have the standing up of the CVE, just to get you a sense for what it is. Back in 2010, Homeland Security created the working group to stand up the CVE. And who attended? How about Imam Muhammad Majid? Who here has not heard of him? He's the head of Islamic Society North America, the lead Muslim Brotherhood unit in America. How about Dalia Mogahed, who was the president's Islamic outreach person for a period of time? How about Omar al-Amari or Mohammed Ali Bieri? Do these names sound familiar? Okay. They all are associated in a factual way with the Brotherhood. So the people that DHS was bringing in to do the CVE have clear Muslim Brotherhood connections. So back in 2012 here, or 2011, this NPR article came out and talked about how there's this training going on about the Muslim Brotherhood and terrorism and how terrible it is. And it basically went on to point out that one of these guys is going to be teaching at the CIA later that summer. That person was me. And immediately, one of the people who was involved in the article was a man named Bill Braniff. And this is just covering some territory for the people I briefed on the Hill. And here's one of the people who was writing some articles on the left. And here's CARE coming out and saying, hey, that NPR article, we demand that training be stopped. And this set in motion a whole series of things where you'd have a left-leaning journalist or publication have some bogus expose in the same news cycle followed by CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, demanding that person be removed. I was literally stalked for a period of years there. And here is the letter to me. It's sanitized from the CIA saying, we not only can't have you come here because it's coming from the White House, but we are not even allowed to do the counter-terror mission anymore. It's now going to be called Countering Violent Extremism, and Department of Homeland Security is going to take over that mission, and they will come up with standards to do this. So, who are the key influencers to help set up the CVE? Well, here is a Freedom of Information Act document of the people. Pardon? Pardon? Well, yes, but we do have that, like, of these 12 people, 10 of them are leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. So when you go to DHS and find out the people who stood up, the CVE, who were brought in to do it, we already saw the steering committee earlier, they were brothers. And we could actually show that some of these people were like Edna Lukovic. How about Mustafa Kifa, who makes no bones about who he is. So we know where the CVE is coming from. And here we have a letter signed by Congressman McCall to Mustafa on the Council of American Islamic Relations. The moderate Muslim is our most effective weapon. Well, the reason I'm giving this briefing today is because Congressman McCall is the head of the Homeland Security Committee in Congress, and he just cleared a permanent establishment of CVE at DHS, which would institutionalize this relationship. There's an international component of this too that I'm still building out.
How much are you getting paid to do that?
Huh?
How much are you being paid to do that? You can't really believe that.
I no longer am surprised at what people can make themselves believe if they feel like there's a vote for it. I'll stop there. I don't know what his situation is. I tend to actually, let me reclama that if it gets turned into a product. I would say that we have noticed the incredible power of institutionalized staff to steer committees completely off course. So here we have, remember we mentioned Elie Bieri? Well, here's Elie Bieri. He says, with my 22 years in the GOP, who here has not heard of Elie Bieri? Okay, we know who he is, right? He's a brother. There's no question about it. You see right up there, he's got the Rabia symbol saying he supports the Brotherhood in Egypt. What does he say here on his Twitter? With my 22 years in GOP, friends throughout hundreds of U.S. security, policing agencies, and academia, no future presidency will reverse the reforms underway, putting these policies in. This is what he's saying. And by the way, that's when that came out. He realized he had to clean up that because it's so overtly Muslim Brotherhood. So he took off that sign, and this is what I saw last night. And just so you can see what's in the background, is here it is on his Twitter account. You have a woman, American, with her gun, and now there she is. This is, you know, you can't make this up. And of course, right here, he basically says he's a CVE consultant. This is really bad stuff. So those guidelines did come out from the Department of Homeland Security that in the fall of 2011, and I was briefing this round the clock. And what did it say? I'm going to read from my thing here, or maybe not. In recent years, the United States has seen a number of individuals in the U.S. become involved in violent extremist activities, with particular activity by American residents and citizens inspired by Al-Qaeda and its ideology. We know that violent extremism is not confined to any single ideology, but we also know that the threat posed by Al-Qaeda and its adherents is the preeminent threat we face in the homeland. So this document is conceding that Al-Qaeda is the most dangerous threat in America when this came out. But here are their CVE guidelines. Review the training programs to ensure that it uses examples to demonstrate that terrorists and violent extremists vary in ethnicity, race, gender, and religion. So if I'm going to write a portfolio on Al-Qaeda, I have to make up 10 other portfolios to show I've done the diversity. If I have 5 people on my staff, it means that I'm making them do 1/5 the effort if we have 5 different people to prove that we're being diverse. When in fact, if Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization, the only people we really need to be analyzing is Al-Qaeda and their doctrine. And who does or does not engage in that activity outside of it is irrelevant. Would you agree?
Yes.
Okay. Training should focus on behavior, not appearance or membership in a particular ethnic or religious community. I'm fine with that, unless a particular ethnic or religious community stands out for calling for violence. And if they do, they get to be analyzed. Why? Because they constitute an actual threat based on facts. What are the facts? Well, for Al-Qaeda, is that they claim to fight jihad, according to Islamic law. Finally, training should support the protection of civil rights and civil liberties as part of a national security. Don't use training that equates religious expression, protest, or other constitutionally protected activity with criminal activity. Well, I mean, on one level, who disagrees with that? It's not what it says. It's what is intended by that. Which is, and this is the point, if Al-Qaeda and its ideology is the greatest threat in the homeland, and Al-Qaeda's ideology is expressly based on Islamic law, even if they're wrong in their interpretation of Islam, then not allowing us to look at their religious views means we can't look at their doctrine. And therefore we cannot counter them. So, what is the solution? Well, the guy who just left the White House as the counter-terror czar is that man named Quinton Wojtorowicz, and he basically holds, and you can take it that this is the policy in the Pentagon, or in the counter-terror world. We saw the Assistant Secretary of Defense, right? He would not say this under direct examination. It's absurd to realize that we're fighting a war where we are refusing to define those things that define the enemy. Quinton Wojtorowicz said that we really have to hire the Brotherhood here, but really what he said was hire people in the Middle East to do our counter-ideology because it violates the First Amendment for an American to study Al-Qaeda based on its ideology, because you'd be looking at religion. Well, I talked to some people in the federal judiciary, and of course, anybody here a lawyer? That's absurd. It is absurd. It is also policy. So, it all comes down to this in the war on terror. You cannot do 2B and C and counter Al-Qaeda's ideology.
10 more minutes, Steve.
10 more minutes? So, I want to skip through here, but this is just showing that one of the things they came out with, DHS, is domestic terrorism and violent extremism, where they went out of their way. If you parse this like a lawyer, who the militia extremists are, you find out that they're talking about you. And what we have here is you cannot analyze the express basis of the enemy's doctrine in the war on terror. But you can profile American citizens and exercise their numeric constitutional rights. This is what the CVE is fixing on. This is not nearly as speculative as people would like to think. In fact, my whole book is about the fact that almost everything going on is off our radar screen because the language to define it is gone. Therefore, there's nothing for our mind to latch off on. And some of the critical events that are going to happen this year, we don't even have the language to talk about, because this is all over the place. So here we have the 9/11 Commission, and here we have MPAC saying, and this is a testimony, this is our testimony, terminology is important in finding our goal. 9/11 Commission identifies Islamic terrorism as the threat. MPAC recommends the U.S. government find other terminology. So they say get rid of the Islam language. But, you know, the 9/11 Commission was an Article I commission, meaning this was a congressional inquiry. This is Article I oversight. This is Congress doing this study. And what they managed to do is convince bureaucrats to completely dump it. So what we have here is, there's their demand, and here is 2008 Bush administration, the FBI counter-terror lexicon. Here's the National Intelligence Strategy, unclassified, the Obama administration, and here's the 9/11 Commission. Violent extremism 3, but it was used 29 times in the FBI counter-terror. Enemy 3900. Jihad 126 0. Muslim 145 0. Do you see the entire language that defines the nature of the threat is gone? Yeah. Do you understand that the other side knows that they have won the war? Yeah. And standing up to CVE as an institution, they've already got us doing it as a de jure fact. But this would have the effect of making it, standing up a formal organization that would do this. So this is decisive victory in the information battle space. It's the destruction of factual analysis by the removal of words that actually define, replaced by the illusion of knowledge, where none exists. I'm telling you, when you hear the Army talk about human terrain teams, it's because they brought an anthropologist in to do human terrain samples like anthropological field studies. It was so bad that the American Associate of Anthropologists, or whatever they're called, said, if you are an anthropologist and you do this, you will lose your credentials. And it wasn't an anti-war, anti-military point. It's just nuts. It's just crazy. So Here we have Congressman Gohmert using my slides. Here's the document, the Fort Hood report, okay? And this is where we get the, what's the word?
Workplace violence.
Workplace violence. See this? Nowhere in the Fort Hood report from DOD, the official one, did they ever mention any of this language. Now, Major Hassan unconditionally said this was jihad. He made people know it. How can you make a report about Major Hassan in the Fort Hood report and not mention this? Does anybody know? There's an answer. The Fort Hood report never mentions Major Hassan. Now, you just saw that testimony in Congress, right? We just showed that.
Yeah.
Now you could believe that. I mean, it defies belief. But you could believe it. And the goal is to put people in jail for giving this brief. Steve, what do you mean by that? I mean put in jail. So, so here you have Secretary of State Hillary Clinton going to Turkey, meeting with the head of the OIC. Who's never heard of the OIC? The Organization of Islamic Conference. Okay. In 2005, the OIC, with all 57 member states at the head of state level, came up with a 10-year program of action to make defamation of Islam a crime in every jurisdiction in the world. Here's Hillary Clinton in 2011, meeting in Turkey with the head of the OIC, Ekmal Dinisanoglu, agreeing to do that, and agreeing to use old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming. I think what I'm going to do, and then the State Department then hosted the event where that passed the Human Rights Council. So I think what I'm going to do is check a couple things here. We'll wrap it up. This is just basically pointing out that 1618 is a parallel operation with the CVE. The CVE is a blocking action. It kind of like, if you know military terminology, the blocking action is to keep you from being able to counter because you don't have the language to talk about it. That's, so you could say it's the blocking defensive action, and the offensive action is implementing 1618 that takes positive control of the language you use at a treaty level by agreement. And I think I'm going to end it right here because I think we're out of time. And we just check and see if there's anything I really want to show. But no, I think that does it because I want to take at least a couple questions if there are any. So tonight's brief will be cleaner. I decided to drop what I was doing to talk about the CVE because I'm willing to bet most people here have never heard of it, right? And I'm telling you, this is about controlling the language that you're allowed to use to talk about Islam. If you've ever been accused of being an Islamophobe, you've experienced it. You saw that secretary clamp down on this. The goal will be to criminalize this. So I think it's very important to understand that there's a bill before Congress that cleared Homeland Security to stand up an entity that will actually do that. We know that domestically the Brotherhood basically are the architects of this. What's not in this briefing is we know that our State Department has deferred to UAE and institutions in Qatar to help frame our CVE there. So it's very, very dangerous.
Before you take a couple of questions, and all we can handle is two because of time limitation, but you'll be available tonight.
I'll be around as long as you want.
And Steve, I would like you to speak to your book over there. They're priced at $25. It's a new release, but if you would just say a word about that.
Okay, what happened is, I was mobilized. My background was at international law, International Export Council, and I was working for, at one point, two of the biggest publishing companies in the world. Got mobilized to work on the Joint Chiefs of Staff targeting directorate where I did targeting, and became somewhat of a dissident because I realized from my legal background, having been, as a lawyer, I did comparative international law. So wait a second here. There is such a thing as Sharia. In the Muslim world, it is the law. And it's not an argument. If you disagree, you're wrong. Now this is not just an academic argument, because if a general or a secretary or a president, and it's not just Obama, thinks that Sharia is some ethereal thing, you've completely lost the ability to gain traction on what they're talking about. Everything the Brotherhood says, everything Al-Qaeda says is about Islamic law. So what happened is I started putting these briefings together over a period of time, and they were very good. They were called some special operators designated that brief the red pill brief. Because if you see the brief, no matter how much you disagree with it, if you see it initially, I got you. You're going to turn because you're going to see things. It's going to start making sense. Okay, and you'll realize that the way you understand the war before then had you, even if you disagreed, even if you were on our side, if you will, on the issue, you were on our side in a way that you couldn't convert that to action that could counter what's going on, dissipating your energy. So what happened is, Christine Brim at the Center for Security Policy, said, Steve, somebody's going to kill you one day, and we'll lose your briefings. Could you please turn it into a book? So I did. So what this book is now I'm going to say something that sounds really, really arrogant, and I don't mean it that way. I wish I had never learned anything about Islamic law. I wish I had never done this, because I liked my corner office in Bethesda. This is what the war on terror is. And everything up against it that disagrees with it is a lesser understanding. I did it for years. I did it on the Joint Staff. I did it at CENTCOM. I did it in the special ops world. In a way, I have to be careful about that. The enemy plans to win the war in the information battle space. He doesn't. It's just like North Vietnam and General Giap. Yes, you guys are great. You win every battle. Your combat troops can't be beaten, but your generals and your secretaries are morons. They too thought that if you have enough tactical victory, you can bootstrap yourself up to strategic success. If you have no strategy, you have no ability to win a war. America is now tagged with always being able to fight the tactical engagement, always thinking that strategy is just taping together a whole bunch of operational plans, and never understanding that strategy is about how you understand victory. The Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, they understand that first of all, the very ability to convince us to take our language away means that our intelligence community is completely broken. Completely broken, because if you were a professional intelligence officer, it's like being a heart surgeon. If you convince a heart surgeon that you could do knee surgery and that will save a pulmonary, you're talking to an idiot. If you convince the intelligence community that they can do intelligence without doing threat-based factual analysis, they know they're talking to numbnuts. This group has a religious group orientation to it, so I use numbnuts. Believe me when I tell you. I did work in the military. I can string those words together, and sometimes my nose starts bleeding. I get so angry. So what happened is this book was taken from my briefs, and it starts off with some stuff that's really dry. What is Islamic law? What does it say? And I'm not getting into stuff that doesn't influence the war. It's specifically what drives the terrorist activity. Who is the Muslim Brotherhood? Who is the OIC? And what happens is by the time we get to chapter 6, it's running on all pistons. So you could read chapter 6, how the OIC is going to succeed this year in making it a crime for you to say anything that Islam forbids. And that the CVE will make sure that that can be enforced domestically. Chapter 7, the first part of chapter 7, speaks about, chapter 7 is the big chapter. It's 100 pages long. It's called Catastrophic Failures. And the first half are the failures domestically. How about this? Going from Anwar al-Awlaki to Major Hassan to the Sarnea brothers to the people who did that thing in Gardenia, Texas, every one of them were identified as terrorists, and no action was taken until they struck. None. Okay? You can read that. The second half is about how the war in Afghanistan and Iraq was a failure because we failed to account for Islamic law. And it really focuses on the command in Afghanistan. I always say MNFI, and that's exactly wrong. That's Iraq. But it's the command there, and how, without knowing it, I tend to prefer to think that they don't know it. they actually had our troops formally subordinated to Islamic law. And not even having a clue that they did. Why? Because not only do they get our national security community to not do fact-based threat analysis, they get them to get into these gooey, squeezy, squishy political science and anthropological studies. And all they have to do is run them through that. And they know that by virtue of the fact that they'll do it, they're not really top-tier intel analysts. See, Sergeant Major, I would argue...
I'm going to start retired on the Marine Corps.
Well, heck with you anyhow. Heck with you then. But what I'm going to say is, if you think you do strategic intelligence any different than you do tactical intelligence, IPB, intelligence, if you think there's something about strategic intelligence that IPB can't handle, that's because you're talking to a professor who's a wannabe. Oh, I'm serious. So this book goes into it. Part 8 talks about the total, you cannot, and I got your question, sir. You cannot understand the penetration operation of the Brotherhood and abroad if you don't understand that that penetration comes through the prevailing left-wing narrative. They understood in the 1980s that the left-wing cultural postmodern narrative was going to take this country down, and they just joined it. That's how they took over the interfaith outreach movement as well, which we'll talk about tonight. Yes, sir.
I've been involved with some organizations like the Aramaic Broadcasting Network, where we talk to 23 million people about Sharia law and stuff like that. What I want to know, there's a lot of agencies, a lot of people I know speaking out against this. What's the time frame you say they're going to make this illegal and throw my butt in jail? And are you part of UNCUR's hit list?
Yes, I am. And the action is, you have the 10-year program of action started in 2005. I immediately started briefing, watch what's going on in Europe with this cartoon crisis. This is really important. Then we got a war to fight. And then a couple months later I said, Steve, could you please come down to SOCOM's I.O. conference and explain how it was you called this? And remember, it was a Danish cartoon, and you had Charlie Hebdo do stuff. The first month of the 10th year, January 2015, they whacked the Charlie Hebdo people. They tried to kill the people in Copenhagen. And when you had the Gardenia text event happen, the narrative was put in place. It's supposed to go down this year.
When?
Well, I don't think it's, they said 10-year plan, so I think it's going to kind of culminate somewhere around the fall somewhere. They like to engineer these events. I would argue that we've already had a couple that failed for reasons that misfired. One in 2009, one in 2012. And in this bigger brief, I do that. But I think we're seeing Congress, Republican Congress, stand up a permanent CVE. The CVE is actually about firing people who engage in this language. I'll have the article out in a couple days. I'll send it to you for people who want it. But what I would like to say is, this is not theoretical. It's very concrete, and it's very scary.
Would this be part of the civil disobedience that would occur, in your opinion, if this starts to happen? Would this establish it, start it?
Which civil disobedience?
No, people just won't put up with this, I don't think.
Well, the question is, this is off the radar screen of people. They're not going to understand that it even happened. Well, let me give you an example. A parallel action with 1618 by the OIC at the UN is that a Soros group called Article 19 is redefining the word incitement in a treaty that the U.S. is a party to. So that when, through some dry, opaque international treaty, the word incitement gets changed, it means that they can all of a sudden arrest you for what is now the new definition of incitement. And the new definition of incitement is that the old definition of incitement is, I'm the head of a racist group, and I'm telling you, my followers, to go out and beat people up. And you do. That's incitement. That's a crime. And you should be prosecuted for it. Okay? The new definition of incitement is that I say something to this crowd. This guy over here decides he wants to get angry at it and beat me up. And he says, if you don't stop saying that, I'll be incited, and I'm going to go after you. Well, that is the battered wife syndrome. Or that is creating a legal basis for terrorism. And that is the new definition of incitement. The third party, who you're not even talking to, uses that as a basis. Because remember, saying anything about Islam that Islam does not want you to say is a violation of Sharia law. And the penalty can be death.
Steve, you're fantastic. And we got to stop. Because you've been up since 4, and we got to save you for tonight, and we still have to get lunch in. So anyway, you'll have a chance to talk with him tonight. We have books over here if you want to look at them. They'll also be available tonight. And so anyway.